and welcome to the Albums Only podcast. My name is Jacob Slater. With me is, as always, is my friend Alan Beavers. Change of pace, I'm introducing the episode because actually this episode was requested, the album was requested by a good friend of mine, Mike, over in the UK. And, he wanted to hear us talk about Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys, which in context it makes sense because the UK was actually incredibly interested in Pet Sounds when it was released. It was actually number 2 on the charts way back in 1966, and it remained so in the top 10 position for 6 months after it released, whereas in the US only really hit top 10, and even in the US didn't really get favorable reviews.
The other, and that's a great point, Jacob. I just wanted to add, that's something that I want to talk about that I think will be a lot of fun, is the historiography of the reception of Pet Sounds. And it's a really interesting thing, I think, with rock and roll, particularly albums that are 50 years old or more. So I'm looking forward to talking about that. It's something we haven't talked about before. I know you're going to have lots of interesting things that you want to talk about there, but that's a great point with starting that off. That ties into exactly one little avenue that I'd like to talk about. So
Pet Sounds is an album that, it really singular artistic work, I think. I remember when I was just starting to get into music, and I was one of those classic rock kids. I was getting into Jimi Hendrix and the Doors and everything. And, when you're just starting out, there are certain names you hear kind of getting into music, and, you'll hear, like, you should check out the Beatles, you should check out the Doors, you should check out Pet Sounds. And it was never check out the Beach Boys. It's always check out Pet Sounds, because that album is such an important piece of work, and it's such a lauded, critically piece of work that it really is overshadowed the Beach Boys as a group. And it wasn't until like a few years later that I even checked out another album by the Beach Boys. My entire experience of them was centered around album, which wasn't the Beach Boys' first album. It was the Beach Boys were already a very successful group, kind of the pioneers of what we call surf rock. It is kind of strange that you have this band that has already reached critical success, releases an album that's so important that it dwarfs past and eventually future projects.
And that's the sort of my introduction to the Beach Boys as well. My aunt and uncle were actually big fans of the Beach Boys and had seen them in concert a couple of times. My introduction wasn't Pet Sounds. My introduction was sort of Barbara Ann and those sort of poppier songs. And so I have to be honest with you, I growing up, and this is when I was very young and just getting into rock and roll and its legacy and everything else that goes on when I'm 14, 15, 16 years old, I didn't really have much respect for the Beach Boys because I just thought they were just sort of pop figureheads. So it's interesting to me to hear Pet Sounds and to get into it and to really enjoy it. And that didn't come till much later. Obviously not since we got together and listened to it. But it is such a great album in terms of production that I think it really, in a lot of ways, it dwarfs a lot of the other things that they've done. And that's not to belittle all the other hits that they've had and the other stuff that comes later, which I don't have as much of a familiarity with. But I think Pet Sounds is such an instrumental album, and it's so important because it was inspired by the Beatles, and the Beatles were inspired by Pet Sounds, and so it sort of feeds off that. And I think this sort of creation, this sort of competition to create the great album was really fruitful for everyone involved. And I just find the Beach Boys now, I think of them in a much greater light.
Honest here, the Beach Boys themselves have not done themselves any favors with regards to how they are viewed. There's certainly a long history of not reaching for the creative and musical heights that they achieved on this album, and instead kind of reveling in what you would call like nostalgia acts. You can kind of see why the Beach Boys are not as well regarded as, say, the Beatles, who had a kind of much bigger body of work, a kind of much more acceptable and respected body of work as compared to the Beach Boys, who really had Pet Sounds, and then through whatever kind of internal issues were going on at the time. And if you do read the history of the Beach Boys, it is a very depressing and also kind of surreal history for a band that was known originally for surf rock. But when you talk about the Beach Boys and you talk about the Pet Sounds as an album, the Beach Boys is a band composed of Al Jardine, Bruce Johnston, Mike Love, Carl Dennis, and Brian Wilson. But Pet Sounds is itself really a Brian Wilson album. Brian Wilson was not only the major creative force prior to this album, he is really the major creative force on Pet Sounds at all. It is really his words, his arrangements, all crafted by him. It's really an album that could only have been done, I think, by Brian Wilson, a man who was reluctant to perform live, was very much interested in the kind of construction of songcraft, who had obviously been inspired by studio greats like Phil Spector. In fact, a large amount of the Wrecking Crew, who were the session musicians who made up the Wall of Sound, feature on this album. And this was what he came up with, a album that takes from the past of works like Phil Spector, but at the same time is, intensely personal in its songwriting.
This is actually one of the reasons that, learning about Pet Sounds, and I knew a decent amount about Pet Sounds and how it was made and sort of just the ins and outs of what songs were around during that time and whatnot. But learning a little bit more about Brian Wilson's love of the studio actually made me endear myself more to him, because I'm kind of that same way. Like, I don't, and this is my own personal preference, I'm not a big fan of the live album, for example. Like, I go to concerts. I go to a couple concerts a year, but I'm not a huge, concert goer. I find what you can do in a studio and the sort of perfection that you can create there much more interesting. I'm more interested in the studio perfection of Steely Dan than I am in sort of the live ramblings of Fish or some other artist who is clearly talented, group of artists or bands that are talented. But I just find that really interesting. So I have to say that actually, Brian Wilson, it just sort of, I gained so much respect for him, actually, when you listen and then you see the list of instruments that are on this album and who all played. It's just like, holy crap,
I mean, just from the session musicians, you can see names like Hal Blaine, who worked with the Wrecking Crew, as well as Steely Dan and Simon & Garfunkel, Glenn Campbell, who would have his own respected career as a country musician, and Carol Kay, who was a bassist, played with, I think, over 1,000 acts, as far back as Phil Spector to Frank Zappa and all these other. So Brian Wilson, I don't know how much he considers himself a genius, but I think the way he's been able to gather almost 60 musicians and to be able to craft an album that had never really been done before. Because I think although this features many session musicians from Phil Spector's Wrecking Crew, this is not a Wall of Sound album. Wall of Sound, I think, really kind of describes what a Phil Spector album sounds like. It's very kind of a big push of sound. You can hear all these different things kind of assaulting you at the same time. But Brian Wilson has all these disparate instruments and sounds. He pushes it in such a way that there's a much deeper kind of range, I think.
There's a range, and the thing I think about, and the thing that you sort of the word that you kind of see that sort of sums up everything is symphony, right? Because you've got lots of different things going on, but they're all timed and they all have their place. And so it's with Phil Spector, and we talked about this a bit with when we talked about Leonard Cohen. Phil Spector just throws a lot of things at you and kind of sees what sticks. Here you've got, this is very deliberate, and we're going to have this come in here, and I want to accent this, and this is so I feel like that's sort of the difference, right? You've got throw something against the wall and whatever works, and you've got, okay, I want this here and that there, and everything needs to be organized into where it should go. And that's sort of the difference, I think, even though they both feature a lot of sound. That I think is the clear distinction.
It mentions here on the Wikipedia page that Pet Sounds is often considered to be one of the first concept albums, not necessarily in kind of its lyrical themes or the shape of the album, but really more of a production concept album. It's really kind of the first album where the recording studio is itself kind of the instrument for music to kind of manipulate sounds and kind of to gather sounds together. Very interesting. I've actually seen Brian Wilson live a few years ago when I was in college. And although he did have a backing band, and his issues prevented him from kind of staying on stage for a long amount of time, it was still, you could still tell how amazing of an artist he was, how well he could craft these together. Let's start on the songs here. Start with the first track, Wouldn't It Be Nice? There are 13 tracks on this album. During the recording process, Good Vibrations was part of kind of the recording process. It was originally going to either be featured on this album or was going to be featured on what was going to be the follow-up to Pet Sounds, Smile, which kind of famously never came to be. Brian Wilson's physiological conditions, or mental conditions, I should say. And it's a very interesting song. It's written by Brian Wilson and Tony Asher, as are most of the songs on this record. It is sung by Brian Wilson himself, with I believe harmony vocals done by Mike Love. It's a good song to start off the album.
I have an interesting thought here. I'm curious where you align here. You mentioned Good Vibrations. I think that's something that we should come back to, just to highlight it, because we aren't going to get a chance to talk. I mean, it could be thousands of albums until we get to review Good Vibrations if we wait till Smiley Smile. So that's something that I want to talk about in just a moment if we could, because I consider Good Vibrations to be, someone could make the argument that Good Vibrations is the greatest song of all time, and I would respect that argument. That's how important and amazing Good Vibrations is. But I'll say this. I think Wouldn't It Be Nice is the best song on this album. I think it's better, and this is gonna get a lot of fun. I think it's better than God Only Knows. And God Only Knows is sort of revered as the high horse on this album. And it's a great song. I like it a lot. I enjoy it. I do. Paul McCartney says it's his favorite song ever. God Only Knows, that is. It's his favorite song ever. I just think Wouldn't It Be Nice is... There's something so lovely about this song. It's got that little, ice cream truck kind of melody at the beginning, and then the single drum hits, and then it kind of explodes. And it's just... to me, it's another perfect song. I think it's the best song on this album, and it's one of the best songs of the 60s, without question. It's gorgeous and memorable, but much like many of the other songs here, simplistic in terms of lyrical content, which is what really is interesting to me. It's very lyrically simplistic, but the structures of the song and the melodies, and that's another thing we can get into, is the vocal melodies, are just, they work so well together. But I think Wouldn't It Be Nice is just, when this album starts and I hear this song, it's almost like an instant smile on my face.
Good Vibrations is a fantastic song. Definitely kind of stands out, stands out of its era and kind of outside of its era. I think mainly the use of the theremin.
The electro-theremin, because it's not the actual theremin, right? Because it's not the one where you actually move your hand and the sound changes. It's the one where there's a knob. So it's the electro-theremin, which is neat. And actually, that was used in Good Vibrations, of course, yes. But also, I Just Wasn't Made for These Times is actually the first one on here. We'll get to that one that uses it. But I always thought... I think now's as good a time as ever to mention Good Vibrations, and I'd be interested in your thoughts here, Jacob. The reason I always thought Good Vibrations was arguably, you can make the argument it's the greatest song of the 60s and one of the greatest songs of all time easily. The reason I always thought it was so great was because there's something slightly sinister about Good Vibrations to me. I don't know if it's meant to be there, and honestly I really don't care, but there's something like when you hear the I'm picking up good vibrations, I often wonder, you get the vibe because of the theremin that maybe this person isn't completely sane. Maybe the person who's singing the song, the protagonist, is a little nutty. Maybe he's picking up good vibrations and they're not mutual. And there's just sort of that tinge of something sinister about that song. And maybe I'm the only person who hears it. But I always considered that to be the magic of Good Vibrations. Is there something a little not quite right about it?
Yeah, I can kind of see where you're coming from. It kind of, the use of the electrothermin really kind of gives it a surreal...
That, and it's almost like, you know, The Police and Every Breath You Take is really a song about, like, someone who's obsessed with a woman. There's almost, I mean, I'm not saying that's what was intended. I'm saying that's the vibe I get on Good Vibrations. The colorful clothes she wears. It's like this sort of afar admiring, but it doesn't seem mutual. There's really little reference that it's mutual. So I always found that to be sort of the appeal to me of the song. I don't know if that's crazy or not, but
You could make an argument for kind of the hidden subtext of darkness within the song. And I think that's kind of part and parcel of the Brian Wilson experience, is that you can kind of see the hidden darkness within songs that are almost kind of naive in their kind of simplicity, kind of their themes.
Yes. Yeah, that's a great point.
But yeah, Good Vibrations, very good song. Wouldn't It Be Nice? Also a great song. It starts off with that, I think you said like ice cream truck. I can see that.
Or like a ballerina, you know, like the little like jewelry box ballerinas that girls have, and you open them and they play a little tune, you know.
And then like that one like drum beat, so it's a kick.
That's the thing. That's the thing that gets me every time. I love that sound. It's just like, you know, it's coming. And it's so distinct. Like, I don't know any other song where that happens and then it sort of like goes right into it. You know, it's just, that particular drum noise is just so, brings to mind the song. It's so great.
And I believe that might be a timpani that is kind of filtered in such a way that it's heavy on the reverb, which kind of gives it its distinctive sound. Timpani, obviously, kind of very big drum, so that kick, and then like pretty much like a wall of sound kind of song, something you'd hear from the Ronettes or the Crystals or something that Phil Spector would have done. And obviously, as I've said, Brian Wilson was very much not so much a student, but an admirer of Phil Spector, to the point where I believe even the decision to mix the album in mono was done as a nod to Phil Spector. There might be other reasons for it, but part of that was kind of calling back to that time. And it's really a song that is fantastic at opening up the album, because it gives you exactly what to expect from the rest of the album. You get Brian Wilson's amazing kind of constructed symphony. You've got amazing harmonies, which I think is really what set the Beach Boys at their best a step ahead of bands like the Beatles, is that their harmony game was like at a much higher level.
I would say that, and that's the thing about Pet Sounds too, is you've got those complicated vocal harmonies that work so well. It's not that they hadn't done it previously, but when you get all of that with sort of the symphonic goodness, so to speak, it just, bar none, how the Beach Boys should be remembered, in my opinion.
The lyrics themselves, I think, kind of set you up for what's going to be about this, what Pet Sounds is going to be about. Because obviously, as I've said previously, the Beach Boys have been known for writing surf songs and car songs, Barbara Ann, Little Deuce Coupe, stuff like that. But, you know, reading the lyrics to even this first song, you kind of get a sense of melancholy, of inner sadness. And even though the lyrics seem a bit kind of saccharine, like, oh, wouldn't it be nice if we were married and all this, but, you know, it's kind of calling to the fact that it is a dream, almost. That this is something he wishes were reality.
And you notice he plays upon, too, like, wouldn't it be nice if we were older? That's interesting to me. Like, it's not, let's revel in our youth. It's, wouldn't it be nice if we were older so we could be together? It's also, you're right, it's saccharine-y, but, you know, maybe this is sort of a biased opinion because of the time and the age that we live in. But, you know, a pop song that's not just about sex almost seems a nice reprieve. Is it just me, or?
These songs were written and co-written by Brian Wilson and Tony Asher. Brian Wilson, this is considered also not only one of the first concept albums, one of the first psychedelic albums. Brian Wilson was using drugs at the time of the recording. I think it mentions up to 4 joints and 1 tab of LSD a day during this process. And I mean, usually when we consider psychedelic music, we kind of consider it to be in terms of sound, I think. Like it brings to mind, In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida by Iron Butterfly, something by Jimi Hendrix, kind of really sound-heavy experiences. But with Pet Sounds, I think this is psychedelic in the way that not only is Brian Wilson kind of constructing these kind of unique and bizarre musical experiences, but his music is also, his lyrics are kind of very introspective. They're kind of digging deep into the core of his being rather than normal fare of the previous music. So when it's saying, wouldn't it be nice, if we were married and everything, it's not just like a pop song. It is Brian Wilson like exploring his own desires and his own kind of thoughts. Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting, I think. I think it's the start of pop music that kind of confronts kind of this emotional honesty. It's not really about, having fun. It's not about, like, we're going to go surfing. It's like, what do I really want? Like, what do I really feel? Like, I really...
Don't you? I mean, I see your point. It's sort of him developing from an adolescent to a young adult, and I think that's also reflected in You Still Believe in Me, because, I'm trying to do these things for you. I'm trying to be a better person. You still believe in me. I think that sort of, goes along with what you're saying as well, because this is more of a ballad song. You Still Believe in Me, and it definitely fits sort of the description that you've given of his progression as a writer and as a lyricist,
and really like as a person, because just the first line, the first verse in You Still Believe in Me is, I know perfectly well I'm not where I should be. I've been very aware that you've been patient with me. Like, as someone who has emotional issues, perhaps not in the same way that Brian Wilson does, but my own issues, that's something I've felt myself, is like, and even said myself that to people that, I know that I can be a burden in that way. And so thank you for kind of dealing with that. So it's really kind of Brian Wilson, very emotional. I like this song that before this album, I did not know what a tack piano was. And, this song opens up with a tack piano, which turns out is a piano where the hammers are either lacquered or they're actually, the hammers of the piano are like stuck with nails or tacks, so that when they hit the strings, you get this kind of tinny sound, very percussive kind of sound. And I had never known what that sound was and how he produced it, but if you have heard like ragtime music or any music that is trying to sound like from the 1920s, it's a tack piano, or sometimes called a honky-tonk piano.
You know what I love about this track, too? I just have to say, musically, I love the bicycle horns at the end of this. That goes to that, like, innocence. There's a certain innocence to this album, more so than, honestly, any album. I always like to compare the Beach Boys to the Beatles, and I know that's its own ball of wax, and some people hate that, and whatever. That's something that I never felt the Beatles, maybe with the exception of Rubber Soul, but even then, I don't know, there's something very playful and sort of whimsical about Pet Sounds that I really don't feel the Beach Boys ever got. And I find, like, when I hear that horn, I'm like, that's exactly what I'm talking about when I talk about that sort of whimsy.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anyone was ever expecting to hear an album where you just hear, like, bicycle horns, stuff like that.
Yeah,
it's like,
just right at the end.
It's like Brian Wilson throwing things against the wall, and you're like, why has he got, like, Coke cans out here and, like, all this stuff?
But, like, but like we said, like we had mentioned earlier, it's trying it out, right? But it's not just like mixing it in with everything else. It's like very distinct, and it's at the last 15 seconds of the song, and it's just a couple of like honks, you know. So it's got to be right where it needs to be, and it can only be a few, and it's not a big deal, you know.
It's just like adding another texture onto this kind of tableau
right.
that he's created, and each song is really kind of its own distinct beast in that regard. So move on to the third song on the album, That's Not Me, sung primarily by Mike Love, with Brian Wilson doing backup stuff. The first song that Mike Love sings lead on, you'll sing it a couple more times on this album. Yeah, I like this song as well. You know, it's almost like a haunting song. The reason, like, the way that Brian Wilson has like this tone that holds like underneath the lyrics. It always kind of gives me a sense of darkness.
Yeah, there is a beautiful. That's Not Me is one of my favorite tracks. It's personally relatable to me. Just I packed up my bags and head for the city, but I soon found out that my lonely life wasn't so pretty. It's sort of like this glamorization of like L.A. or like the big city, and I'll get away and I'll be able to be myself and make my own way. And then you get there, and it's not how you had planned. So it does have like that haunting sort of, that realism hits you, and that's that sort of bittersweetness in the song. And again, the other thing I love about this, I think this is now as good a time as any to talk about it, is this is a 2.5-minute song. I kind of miss this in pop music. All these songs are so tightly constructed. It doesn't take more than 2.5, 3 minutes for almost every song here. Every song is either between 2 minutes and 3.5 minutes. And I love that. This song feels like you couldn't make it today and it would be less than 4 minutes, because it would try to play out that mood. But here it's so succinct and well done. It's just great.
It just kind of like speaks to the era in which it was recorded, where it wasn't really about albums, it was about singles. And you didn't want like singles that were too long. You just wanted something like that kids would put on and dance to. It wasn't really considered a good business move to kind of create longer songs,
right,
or to kind of do anything in that regard, which is why Pet Sounds was influential in that way, in that it took the pop format of the time and still managed to kind of create this diverse sonic landscape and kind of explore themes beyond kind of the teens having fun kind of motif.
Well, that's the thing. Like, the thing I find interesting is it's still like, right, like we hear a lot of like sad and good and like bad and mad and very basic words, but they're aiming at something more important or something higher than just those words. So I find that's what I mean when I said earlier it's sort of a transitional album between like adolescence and adulthood, because you're coping with these sort of harder, more emotional things, but you don't quite have the vocabulary to of an adult. So I think of it that way, as sort of this fascinating transitional album, because you've got like the vocabulary that's fairly simplistic, and you've got these sounds that are almost resemble childhood, but yet they come together in a way which is much more sophisticated. So I'm always stuck with this juxtaposition that this is an album between adolescence and adulthood.
Brian Wilson is kind of his lasting legacy is kind of this idea that he's yearning for this kind of simpler time, very kind of in all of his kind of work. You kind of understand it in a sense that, this was a guy who was suffering emotionally. He had been in kind of the music business since like his teens. Even his dad was a person in the music industry to some degree. So, you can kind of really see why Brian Wilson would kind of develop this kind of a musical and lyrical interest, because this was a guy, I think, who wanted the stuff that he sang about. He didn't really think he had, when he says that I packed up my bags and left home. That's pretty much him leaving with the Beach Boys and everything, kind of leaving home and kind of losing that sense of home that you can get. And, it's, although this is written by Brian Wilson, it's not strictly autobiographical, obviously. Tony Asher, who worked with him on this album, kind of, I guess, gave him a degree of artistic inspiration to the point where it's an album that you can kind of see Brian Wilson's own torment in, and you can kind of see it in us all, I guess. I think anyone can kind of feel the same feelings that Brian Wilson does.
If we move along to Don't Talk, Put Your Head on My Shoulder, this is, I'll be honest with you, this might be the least interesting track to me on the album. It's just another ballad, still sort of in the vein of You Still Don't Believe in Me. Just very simple, very sweet, but sort of, to be honest, insubstantial. Yeah, this doesn't really do too much for me. It's fine.
Actually, this has been one of my favorite songs, personally, on the album. Just because it's not really of the same kind of craftsmanship as the other Wilson songs. It's very kind of simple. But I think it works in its simplicity, that it's kind of like this simple song. And I've always really loved Brian's vocals on this song, the way he kind of hits that peak on the chorus when he says, "Listen to my heartbeat," and he just like rockets up there. For some reason, I've always really liked this song, just because I think it's one of Brian's best works vocally as a performer. Move on to track number 5, I'm Waiting for the Day, another song that is sung lead by Brian Wilson. There are just moments where it's light and then it just like crashes down on you.
Yeah, I think they play with dynamics wonderfully here, I think, a little bit. You're right. There's that sort of loud, quiet thing going on that really works. And I think the ending of this song, too, I love just sort of like it ends on a high note and tries to go out on it. And I think it just works so wonderfully. And, of course, again, you get that timpani that really makes itself known in this one, which is really neat.
Boom, boom. Yeah, and it's a song that it's not really, well, I guess it is a love song, but it's like a one-sided love song, really. It's Brian saying that he still loves this woman and he'll always love this woman, even though she doesn't love him, and that she's still thinking about this other person, which, that's something I've experienced, this kind of feeling that you're always secondary in someone's thoughts in that way. And then by the end, he's just like, "Oh, you didn't think."
Right.
No, we're like, "Oh, you thought I was just going to forget it," but no, we're bringing it back up.
Right. Yeah. No, that's a great point. The strings too in this. That's what I love, that ending where like you didn't think that I would sit around. This, the way that sort of hits, and then the strings right before that lead into that explosion at the end. It's like, it is almost like confronting that, isn't it? It's almost at the end when he explodes into that. It feels like a confrontation, like you just said. Like, yeah, and I like that. It's a great way to think about it.
Like, it's anything like, "Oh, I'm waiting for the day when you can love again." And it's like, "Oh, but wait, I'm not gonna let this guy just like waltz in, like try to wreck all my work." It's very kind of a beautifully sad song, I think. I've experienced that sense of longing before. Let's see, we move on to track number 6, Let's Go Away for a While, which is the first of 2 instrumental tracks. These instrumental tracks, I think, you might get the impression that they're not really important because they don't have lyrics attached to them, although apparently at one point they were going to be like full-fledged songs with lyrics, but Wilson decided that they kind of worked better as instrumentals. Let's Go Away for a While might be my favorite of the 2 instrumental tracks. It's very kind of calm and soothing, and yet it kind of like has these elements of like lounge music.
I was thinking lounge, maybe even a little bossa nova in there. I think you're right. I'm a sucker for instrumentals in rock and roll, and this one just feels so right. It feels so 60s. It just feels totally 60s. Like, you could get some grainy like footage and show it to me like, as this is going on, like people at the beach just enjoying themselves, and this is in the background, and I'd be like, this is perfect. I love it.
If you heard music by like Burt Bacharach or something like that, it's very much in that same vein. It's just like a very kind of beautiful song that kind of incorporates all these kind of different things, like lounge music and even kind of bit of like psychedelic, very interesting song. That moves on to the last track of the first side, Sloop John B, which is actually a arrangement of a classic Caribbean folk song, which is sung by Brian and Mike Love. This is like the song I would point to if someone asked me, like, what's a song where the production saves it? Because it's really kind of a, if you kind of look at it, it's a really kind of dumb, silly song. But when you bring in, like, the Beach Boys harmonies, you kind of have this grand, swirling arrangement.
It's the melodies that make it. It's the vocal harmonies that make this. I have to be honest with you. You're absolutely right. The way that they interweave and the way they set each other off, it works perfectly here.
I mean, sans Brian Wilson's arrangement, it's really kind of just kind of a silly little folk song. You don't really put too much thought into it. It kind of fits in with kind of emotional vulnerability of the previous songs, as it is just like about a guy who got drunk and he's kind of stuck in this crappy situation. It's the forgettable pop song in other regards. First song on the next side of the album, God Only Knows, is, I don't think you get like a bigger song for the Beach Boys than God Only Knows. That is like the golden trophy of Beach Boys songs.
It is. I mean, it's often considered that. I didn't realize how contentious the debate is over the best Beach Boys song. I hang my hat on Good Vibrations, but God Only Knows is Pitchfork.com rated the number one song of the '60s. Of all the songs in the '60s, it was number one. God Only Knows, again, I mentioned it previously, Paul McCartney's favorite song of all time, or so he says. I think it's great. Look, it's great. It's a wonderful song. I love it. But I just think it's slightly overrated. And that's all that just slightly overrated. But it's gorgeous. And look, they took a big risk. Putting God in the title in the '60s when you're part of the hip movement, or you're trying to be part of the youth. The idea of putting God in the title, that's risky. I feel like they took a risk there, and no one seemed to care. It got accepted as sort of an existential God is in me, God is in you sort of thing, and that's great. And I think it's a beautiful song. I mean,
this is the only song where Carl Wilson sings lead. He does a fantastic job.
Can I ask you a question? Have you ever known a love song like this to lead off with I may not always love you? That's crazy to me.
It is very strange to kind of say, I love you, but I don't. Sometimes I won't love you. It's definitely kind of opens up weird. It is probably the most, and I've already been talking loads about kind of Brian Wilson's emotional explorations during the making of this album. But I think this is like why it works so well as a love song is because it is nakedness and vulnerability. It's not just that, I may not always love you, but I don't know what I would be without you. Like, I can't even conceive of what kind of person I would be without, the woman of this song.
Yeah, those soaring back vocals, too, that just, like, really hit the high pitch. They just work perfectly.
This is a song I think that it works in its original format. I think it could also have worked if it was reworked a bit. I feel like kind of the sleigh bells and everything in there kind of give it a bit more of a upbeat quality, when really it could just have used like the strings that you can hear in the low. I think it could work in either direction, but it's like this combination of like Carl Wilson's vocals and like this really kind of deep emotional lyrical content. It's kind of not just saying like she loves you, yeah. It's like, what good would being alive do me if I didn't have you? The world would be meaningless. Like, it's kind of surprising, and it's like emotional vulnerability. And I think that's I can see why it was so popular. I can see why Paul McCartney would have enjoyed it because he's a practitioner and a big fan of pop music in that vein. And it was very popular in Europe. It reached number 2 on the British charts when it was released. As an A-side. It was released as a B-side in the U.S. and only hit number 39.
Yeah, the irony for me is the fact that wouldn't it be nice and God Only Knows were on a single together and they would flip the A side and the B side depending on where they were for those two tracks. You want to argue that that's the best 45 ever? You got a good argument.
And Caroline No was also released as a single, but only credited as Brian Wilson, which is probably why it only reached number 32. I guess Brian Wilson didn't have the same name recognition as the Beach Boys at the time. But, you listen to God Only Knows, and it's, like, surprising to think how low it kind of charted in the U.S. The whole album was kind of a mid-level success in the United States for the Beach Boys.
I often wonder, this was released the very same day as Bob Dylan's Blonde on Blonde, yeah. I often wonder, I mean, we look back at it now and can say there was so much good music, there was so much great music. I wonder if even at the time they understood or knew that too. And it was sort of like everything just couldn't find a place, It was possible for something to get lost,
Yeah. I mean, obviously neither of us were around during the mid-'60s, so it's really kind of just questioning, like, what was it about Pet Sounds that didn't really grab American audiences in the 60s, but, like, blew people away in Britain in the 60s? Like, what was the difference, in kind of attitudes and kind of musical tastes?
This is interesting to me because I believe that Brits have always had better taste than Americans, pretty much. I mean, I always think about it in this terms. The United Kingdom was a place where Laurie Anderson's Oh Superman was number 2. I couldn't imagine that in America. It would blow my mind if for a song like Oh Superman, which if you're not familiar with the song, you should check it out, and you can find it on Spotify or any of the major music distribution areas. You've probably heard it in commercials, but it's a vocoder from the 80s. It's Laurie Anderson and a vocoder and very simplistic. It's a 6-minute song. Only in the United Kingdom could that go to number 2. I mean, in comparison to the United States. I mean, it's just it blows my mind. I just always think Brits have better taste. I think they're more experimental in what they'll accept.
And I mean, like, the ironic thing is that Pet Sounds didn't sell well in the U.S., but it inspired the Beatles, who then created Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and all these albums, and which were huge successes in the United States. So, I don't know, it's kind of like these weird, strange tangents that music can go into, where things that you think should be super popular aren't popular, but then inspire something down the line that is popular. It's crazy, but God only knows. I could see the argument for it being overrated because it is so often rated and so highly rated that it's almost inevitable, but still a great song, and one of the best on the album.
I just want to say I agree with you, and I know there's an answer. I like this one a lot too. This has a lot of symphonic components to it. It changes a lot too. This is another gorgeous track to me. Like I never realize how many of these songs I really really love until we go through them here, and I know there's an answer. It's right up there with the rest of them. I mean, like, That's Not Me, and I Know There's an Answer, and Here Today, which we'll talk about soon. Those are all wonderful tracks in their own right.
Yeah, it's a very good song. Lead vocals by Mike Love and Al Jardine, with Brian doing backup and harmonies. I believe the song was originally entitled Hang On to Your Ego. I think really kind of fits the song, and I think it really kind of... Hang On to Your Ego was a song title that really kind of put it in its era. The 1960s, where people were becoming more interested and invested in kind of the psychology of the human mind, exploring people's inner thoughts and everything. The song itself, lyrically, kind of follows that same direction. You know, talking about people who they come on like they're peaceful, but inside they're so uptight. They trip through their day and waste all their thoughts at night. It's definitely a song about the people of that era, kind of the hippies who consume drugs but are still kind of stuck inside their own heads. To that.
Yeah, it's interesting too, coming from Wilson, who was just starting to really get heavily into drugs at the time. I think another interesting point too for this track is you can actually get an interesting cover of this that's called "Hang On to Your Ego" if you check out Frank Black's first album from the Pixies when he went solo in 1993. There's a cover of "Hang On to Your Ego" if you're interested in a more rock, mainstream 90s rock version, which is really interesting as well.
Supposedly that it was Mike Love, I believe's influence that got the name changed, because he didn't really consider it. Like, I think if you're really going to be talking about the Beach Boys, Mike Love is eventually going to kind of crop up several times. The more traditional rock and roll minded, the more kind of nostalgia minded, which kind of influenced what the Beach Boys later became. And this was one of the songs that Mike Love actually won writership rights, or kind of author rights for, in 1994, along with Wouldn't It Be Nice, which just so happened to be one of the most famous songs on the record, but I'm not going to point any fingers or make any claims. But, it's a very interesting song. You got a lot of stuff going on. That tack piano comes in again. I think there's some tambourine. And then there's this weird bridge where there's I think a banjo and a kazoo playing. It's a very kind of weird ragtime break. It's very interesting, and it's a very kind of weird song. As a song that really kind of is probably where people could point to when they say this is the first psychedelic album. Just kind of imagery that references drugs, introspective thought, kind of weird musical combinations. Just got a very interesting song. Brings us to Here Today, 10th song on the album. The only album that is sung solely by Mike Love. And, as much as I rag on Mike Love from time to time, actually this is one of my favorite songs on the album.
Yeah, I love how the drums come in around the chorus that really hammers it home, so to speak. That's a really nice accent here. And there's almost too, I like to think too that there's almost the surfer rock breakdown towards the middle of it that just makes me almost think it's sort of a homage to the earlier Beach Boys. I know it's not something that they completely did away with, but I just like the idea that oh yeah, we did this, and here's a reminder of what we used to do, or what we're capable of too. I just find that I find that fascinating and really neat if I think about it in that sort of way. So
I really like how this song kind of, the verses are phrased almost, how Mike Love kind of sings it. I think is very interesting. It's almost like a bouncing song. He'll just hop from word to word, and then suddenly the chorus will come in. It's just it's a racing chorus, just almost like waves crashing upon the shore. But Mike Love really does great work here. I really like the arrangement that goes on. It's an anti-love song, which is interesting. It's about a guy who's telling another guy, don't go out with this girl. She's bad news. Will make your heart feel sad.
Well, that's what again, this song sort of reinforces my thought about the lyrics being simplistic, but I also wonder, if that's not another part of that adolescence to adulthood. I'm man enough to tell you that I understand that you're with an ex-girlfriend of mine, and this might not go the way that you want it to, and I just want to let you know that. Which actually is a somewhat adult move if you do it in the right way, and it feels like that's what Love's trying to do here. So
Brian Wilson, I think, was 22 around the time that he recorded this record, so you can kind of see the shift between kind of more mature thinking and kind of this more adolescent-driven emotions. Really like this song. It's one of my favorites on the record. And then we move on to I Just Wasn't Made for These Times, which is, along with God Only Knows, I think it's one of the songs that I think really kind of encapsulates Brian Wilson's inner fears and turmoil with this song. And it captures it lyrically and it captures it musically. It is beautiful and at the same time almost discordant, dissonant. It's a song that there's like moments in the song where it kind of feels like you're getting surrounded by sound, like you're kind of being trapped by it.
That timpani makes another appearance as well, in a lot of sections there too, works nicely.
As well as the electro-theremin.
Yeah, it's the theremin. The first, it's often credited as the first commercial rock and roll song to have the electro theremin in it. So that's a fascinating thing, and it works really nicely too. You don't really realize that it's a theremin, which is fascinating to me.
It's interesting to think of a time when there was an instrument that was so new that you had never really heard anything like it before.
I think too. There's not only that, which is its own interesting thing to talk about. There's a certain part where there's sort of like a popping sound that is that where the Coke bottles are. There's often credited as Coke bottles, and it sounds to me about halfway through they get this little breakdown where they sort of hit a sound that sort of pops, sort of like if you hit it in a certain way a Coke bottle would. So my thought is that's what it is. It may or it may not be. It may be some instrument that I'm just not as familiar with, but I like that, not only the album, of course, but this song is not afraid to sort of play around with those things in ways that are unconventional, and it really comes through. And in a song that's called "I Just Wasn't Made for These Times," that's the perfect irony to have those sort of sounds in it.
The fact that he's incorporating like just empty Coke cans and stuff into his kind of song. One thing that seems bizarre at first. Then you kind of hear it and you're like, that is kind of amazing that he's been able to get it to work. I think at this as well, amazing to think that, a band that was one of the biggest pop bands in America prior to this record, kind of known for being a pop band, making pop songs that weren't kind of complex emotionally, that there would be a song on their record that is basically about depression. It's a song saying, sometimes I feel very sad, can't find nothing I can put my heart and soul into. Like, that is depression. Like, that is a song about depression. Brian Wilson's struggle with that, and really a lot of people struggle with it.
Not detract from that, I think that's a great point and well said. I think if we move on to Pet Sounds, again, very similar to Let's Go Away from a While, very, very much in that same vein. I think you're right about that. I don't want to just belittle it, but again, it sort of fits what we said earlier about Let's Go Away. And I think, unless you had anything important there to say, I think if we could go on to Caroline No.
Very simple song. I think it kind of touches upon the Beach Boys' roots in surf music more so than really any other song on the record. Yeah, very kind of simple. Yeah, it's kind of strange that a song that's so kind of simple doesn't really stack up to the rest of the songs on the album would be the title track. Very interesting. But yeah. So, last track on the album, Caroline No, which, as I mentioned, was issued as a single, credited to Brian Wilson around this time, and only reached number 32 on the charts. Amazing that it didn't chart so highly, because this is a very beautiful song, much like God Only Knows is a beautiful song. They're very similar in kind of the way they incorporate strings and such in their music, woodwinds and everything. Lyrically, it's it's just a song about a woman who seems to be kind of losing herself. The feeling that you want someone to kind of get better, but they aren't getting better. The album itself ends not traditionally. You get the sounds of a train passing and dogs barking, which in itself doesn't seem all that strange, but I think part of what makes this an important album and an extraordinary album is that Brian Wilson is kind of incorporating the sounds of life into the music. You had the bike horns and bike bells in the earlier part of the album, and then you have like the album ending with just like the noise of trains passing and dogs barking. It is kind of music that is kind of reflecting life, reminding you of reality. I don't think we need to tell anybody that they should check out Pet Sounds. I think this is one of those albums that, is automatically, I think they would even like have it as a class assignment. If you like took like a history of music class, Pet Sounds is probably one of those albums that's going to be on there. So, I mean, what I would suggest is to try out a post-Pet Sounds Beach Boys album. Surf's Up, maybe, Holland. Kind of see what music for the Beach Boys was like post-Pet Sounds. Kind of to see where their directions lie and see where Brian Wilson heads. Because is very rightly one of the best rock and pop albums ever made. Be unlike me, who was only relegated to Pet Sounds when he was younger. Explore the Beach Boys. See if they ever recapture the magic in your eyes of this album.
So just before we close out, I think we've hit about the note for the time to go, but I just want to note, I said earlier I might address the legacy or sort of the influence and how sort of, I guess we'd say the critical reception has changed, how the critical reception of the album has changed. Early reviews in the United States were, good. Throughout the 70s, though, I mean, even into the 70s, this was considered a really good album, but it wasn't until really the late 70s, early 80s that you start seeing in various Rolling Stone record guides that this was a 5-star album. This had been a 4-star album in the early to mid 70s in Rolling Stone's eyes, but that sort of changes in the 70s and the 80s, and I think as the people who were influenced by that by Pet Sounds got a little older, we see that the album grows in stature. And, now today, I mean, we're talking about, Rolling Stone and its 500 greatest albums of all time that was released some years ago in the early 2000s, called the album the second best album of, ever. Of rock and roll. So it's interesting. This is one of those albums that has grown in stature as it gets older, and you have those, and those are some of my favorites because it's really not until you're out of sort of the decade or the era that you can go back and appreciate something. So
it's much like how the Velvet Underground only sold 100 records during their lifespan, as they say, but everyone who bought one of those records started up a band. You really don't hard to see kind of the influence of artists until kind of after their time, and then you can really kind of see how great they were. I think Big Star was another one of those bands that was incredibly good, incredibly influential, but the time they were in, they didn't seem as spectacular as they were.
Yeah, so you can reach us on Twitter at Albums Only. We're available there. We're also available via email if you have interest, and albumsonlypodcast at gmail.com. We want to thank you for joining us. It was a lot of fun to do. We're going to be back next time for the 9th episode. We're going to talk about the band Sparks and their album Kimono My House, which is a fun title and an even more fun album, I believe. Jacob, thank you for joining me, and thanks for leading off this podcast, and I want to thank all the fans for listening, and we'll talk at you next time.